etc. Anyway, so people are still joining, but maybe we should just start. I can start introducing Melissa if you need introduction, but I will anyway. So Melissa is an UCI Counselor Fellow, Professor of Informatics and the Donald Brand School of Information and Computer Science, and Professor of Organization and Management at the Paul Merage School of Management, joint appointment at the University of California, Irvine. And she currently serves as department chair. Congratulations, or maybe sorry, depends on the perspective. Melissa's interests revolve around communication practices in personal and organizational context, specifically in relation to social norms and the nature of personal and professional time in the digital age. Worth mentioning, she just published a wonderful book, which I read from head to toe, and I suggest to everyone, titled The Dreams of the Overlooked, Living, Working, and Parenting in the Digital Age. And I think you'll draw a lot from the book in today's keynote, right? You'll provide many insights. And the book was written with Christine, so we should mention her as well. And I really recommend the book, and it was a wonderful piece of research. Thank you so much for writing it. And thank you so much for making yourself available to give the OCIS keynote. I'm really pleased and honored to have you here, and welcome to the plenary session. And I guess that you can start. Well, maybe let's just say how this works in terms of interactions with the audience. So Melissa will start off with a presentation for flexible 30-40 minutes. Then I will ask you some questions if I have any. Then the other officers can jump in with a few questions, while I would suggest that the audience pose questions in the chat. Two PhD students, which I thank, Julia and Janet, will monitor the chat and will give me a summary of the questions that you want to ask Melissa. And to be just more organized, I will ask Melissa questions on the basis of your chat questions, if that works for everyone. All right, Melissa?
Wonderful.
Ready to start? Thanks so much again.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think we're all both very used to doing this on Zoom, and it's still a little bit strange for me. I don't know about all of you, but I look forward to the day that we're all in a room together and we feel safe about doing that, and we can actually have a conversation. But as Marco said, I'm going to speak for 30 to 40 minutes. It's a little bit dense, hopefully not confusing, but a little bit dense, with the idea that I was really trying to kind of tease into kind of the socio-temporal orders of today's work environment, with the opportunity to have a much bigger conversation with all of you. So I encourage you to ask questions that we can, the conversation can go wherever we feel like it should go after the talk. And there's so many great names and faces on this call that I can see already that I really hope that I can engage you enough that we'll have a really interesting conversation at the end of the talk. So I have to make sure I can get my slides to go forward. So I'm sure that many of you have heard about and or experienced and or studied the ideal worker norm and identity. And oftentimes this is thought of as a norm and an identity, something that is valued and that people want to be part of. And I'm going to talk about where this came from, and I'm going to try and move the kind of concept of the ideal worker beyond the realm of identity into a deeper construct called the socio-temporal order. So what is an ideal worker? Well, I'm going to give you two different definitions based on the kind of type and structure of work that people engage in. So oftentimes what we think of when we hear the idea of the ideal worker, and there's been a lot of research done on this, is this is a person who is in a secure work relationship. So they have generally either they're salaried, or they generally have an idea that even if they're contract work, doing professional work, they're going to be able to get more and more contracts, that work is not precarious. And they are willing to work from home in the evenings, on the weekends. They're ever responsive to incoming texts and email. They're willing to put in FaceTime, whatever that means these days in the office. There's more and more forms of virtual FaceTime. And the bottom line is that they have bought into the idea that they should, and that in order to be good at their job and good in terms of their both quality and perceptions, that they should prioritize work over all other domains of life. Therefore, if they're truly this ideal worker, they really don't have responsibilities outside of work that would require their time and attention. And this is our kind of our classic definition of what an ideal worker is. And again, it's a valued identity. But I also want to think about this construct of the ideal worker less as a valued identity and more as kind of the reality, structural reality of other types of work, especially precarious work. And these, you'll see that this really ties into the virtual technologies of today. So a different form of the ideal worker, and they would probably not label themselves as such, and as scholars, we have not labeled them as such, but you can see how this type of work manifests a certain kind of ideal. And that is the idea that in precarious work relationships, where people are available for just-in-time scheduling, therefore, they don't really need a consistent wage. You can think of this with gig work, a lot of service work, et cetera. And therefore, they're not really in need of traditional benefits from their workplace. Thus, this ideal person does not have responsibilities outside of work that would require a predictable schedule, and they can rely on others for a stable income and benefits. So you can see there's a very different forms of ideal workers, but they're both, I think, at play in today's broad workforce. And I think that this could be summarized perfectly from an actual Facebook post of someone that I studied. So as Marco so lovely described, I have a new book called Dreams of the Overworked with Christine Beckman, and we studied 9 families, and we actually went home with people and spent about 100 hours a week, 100 hours total, not a week, 100 hours total with 9 different families. And one of them was this woman, Teresa, and while we were studying her, she really liked Facebook and she posted all these memes. And we thought this one really did summarize both how she oriented to her own work in life and also kind of what it meant to be an ideal worker in today's day and age. So good things come to those who wait. Nope, not so much. We like to believe that good things will come to those who work their asses off and never give up. So the bottom line is what I want to describe is an idea that the social practices, what it means to engage with people at work, what it means to interact and communicate and coordinate, the economic practices, by that I mean, what does it mean to get paid? How is your time valued? And how do you rely on a basic income? And the digital practice, so what are the means by which we communicate, coordinate, actually engage in work and kind of show up at the office for the work itself, our clients, and our kind of, our colleagues. That all of those practices are central to how work is organized, evaluated, and experienced. And they're all deeply, deeply interconnected with how we allocate time to work. And that's very specific language because it implies that I have time, my time, that I am choosing to allocate to work in different ways and for different costs, for different fees. And I have a lot of individual control over how I allocate my time to work. And I'm going to go ahead and problematize some of those assumptions coming up. But first, I want to get into the idea that we can see the importance of how we kind of engage with time in relation to work through the ways that time use, so time kind of dedicated to work, is actually understood in the socio-technical kind of constructs of the work environment. So what I'm trying to say here is that time is not just time. It's not just that I spend time working and then I walk away. But the time that I spend working very much reflects on my kind of work relationships and how I am judged and how I judge myself in the work environment. And I had the opportunity to write an annals paper recently with Alana Feldman and Aaron Reed, and we really tried to dig into the ways in which time use in social context of work means much more in that environment than work itself. So we went through a giant mass of papers in our field and related fields, and we looked at the ways in which time use is understood both by scholars themselves and the findings of these papers, and understood the way time use kind of implies or implicates other kind of forms of, assessment and evaluation of self and others. So the first one, which I think is pretty obvious, is that time use is oftentimes related to a sense of dedication. So I communicate my dedication to you, I communicate my dedication to my work, and I communicate my dedication to my clients or the people I work for through displays of temporal commitment. And then, not surprisingly, we notice each other's displays of temporal commitment, and we then assess them as a certain kind of colleague or worker because of it. So time use becomes less about what I'm doing with my time than the fact that I'm choosing to allocate it to work, and therefore I'm considered quality worker or good at my job. Second, and this is related, they're all related, obviously, is that time use is performance. And by this, it means it really doesn't matter. I'm not going to look at what people are doing with their time at work, but I'm going to assume that when they spend more hours at work, that they're actually better performers, without investigating how that time is actually kind of populated by what tasks and what they're getting done by when. So there's oftentimes that everything from billable hours to performance assessments, that we're actually equating kind of the amount allocations of time, amount of time, with the quality of the work done. So we're measuring that as the kind of input variable without measuring. And this can be true in many types of work, everything from service work to white collar knowledge work, but particularly in places where there aren't other obvious outcomes to measure. Then time use is identity. And this is kind of the idea that to be competent in any social environment, understanding the temporality of that environment is critical. So how quickly should I respond to somebody? Whether or not it's appropriate to interrupt them, whether or not it's appropriate to be a little bit late when I say I'm going to have something done for you. All of these things really are about social competence in the workplace, well, in any social environment, but in this case, in the workplace. So it's key to acceptance and domain, and in time use in this way, the kind of delicate, nuanced ways that we use and display time are kind of how we signal both to ourselves, like I belong here. These are my people, and I can engage competently in this social environment, as well as how others assess us as being one of the group. So time use is very tied into identity. And then last but not least, time use is power. And this is true both in the kind of structural way that those with official bureaucratic power oftentimes enjoy and actively exercise control over other people's time, when they can come to work, how many hours they have to spend at work, whether or not this means physically or virtually, so forth. But also power over how that time is spent. So here we can think about how people, this is where you can have power over what goes on within the content of an hour and exert control over that. So all of these kind of suggestions that time use and time dedication to the workplace really means much more than just a simple hour is part of a transaction. Really, I like the idea of socio-temporal orders. And there are many kind of constructs like this. So this is a overall, but others talk about temporal regimes, or the kind of logic of a temporal kind of idea and understanding at a particular point in time. A socio-temporal order I find really evocative and useful as a construct that gets at the orientation to time that is shared among a social group. So if we all believe that time means this, or that time has this property, or that one should engage with their time in a certain way, that time is something that you could own. If we all have similar ideas about what time is, and by the way, I've read a lot of books on time, and none of those things are set in stone. To this day, we have no definitive definition of what time is. So very much our social understandings of time become how it's understood and lived in practice. So an orientation to time that is shared among a social group, and therefore produces coordinated rhythms and temporal alignments. And this sociotemporal order is perceived as given, inevitable, and unalterable. So we cannot imagine in the course of doing work in a workplace that one would engage with their time differently, or that time as a kind of essence, as a resource, could be measured differently and could have different kind of properties. I'll get a little bit deeper into that. And I want to take a pause here and say, I know that I haven't used the word technology yet. And that's because I do think that these sociotemporal orders are precursors to how we engage with technology in order to further and intensify our views and our understandings of time in shared groups. So we'll get there. The technology really matters, but the kind of the kernel of how we understand and engage with technology comes from the sociotemporal order rather than the other way around, in my opinion. So what I want to do here is I want to take that kind of idea of the ideal worker, which is, as I said, normally seen as kind of an identity trait, and retranslate that as a sociotemporal order. So what would it mean, and what could we understand about time if we thought about ideal worker as a shorthand for the sociotemporal order of the day? And I'm going to argue that I believe that that's the case. So first of all, at the individual level, all sociotemporal orders are performative and consequential. I perform my use of time and others notice it, and it matters to who I am and how you see me, and kind of substantively how I'm paid, how my time is valued, and whether or not I'm seen as a competent worker, whether or not I am, promoted within my workplace, whether or not I lose a job if I have precarious work. So engaging with time is both highly performative and highly, highly consequential. It's also emotional and internalized. So whether or not I feel that I am using my time well, and this is how as a culture we orient to time across the globe, is very emotional. If I feel like I am wasting time or not using time in a way that's productive, this is one of the #1 sources of guilt and shame. And I've internalized it in whether or not I am a quality person who is a good professional, or all the identity claims that matter to me. Therefore, it's also a mechanism of self-discipline and internalized control. I mean, thinking about back to the monastic order, where we first understood kind of temporal control as disciplinary control through Weber, the idea being that when people get on a similar schedule, they are prioritizing that schedule and embodying that schedule above and beyond any individual needs. So you show up at the meeting because you have to, you come to work on time because it's time to come to work. You don't come to work because you want to or because you're awake or anything like that. So that organizing each other and ourselves through these sociotemporal orders are mechanisms of self-discipline and internalized control. And then at the kind of collective level, so that's kind of how individuals experience sociotemporal orders. The ideal worker at the collective level is intricately connected to the technologies of the day. And by this, I mean that kind of communication channels, tracking technologies, AI algorithms that make sense of who we are and where we are, dashboards that will illuminate performance. All of these technologies which are becoming, or have been, or becoming more and more embedded in workplace kind of monitoring and design, and the kind of how work is conducted. All of these technologies are connected to the sociotemporal order. And by that, I mean, the technologies are designed with ideas of what time is and how it can be measured, how it is or isn't related to ideas of productivity and dedication. And then they perpetuate those ideas through displaying kind of and assessing and evaluating work through these logics of time. And in doing so, the sociotemporal order reifies ontological ideas about the world. And these are key. These are not inherent, and they are something that we, for many, many kind of centuries, humans have developed ideas about time that kind of came in lockstep with the development of new technologies. And it's something now that's very hard for us to think about time in a different light. So the first, time is neutral. a block of time. So my 7 a.m. is the very same block of time as somebody in the East Coast 10 a.m. and somebody in Europe's 3 p.m. right now. That we are all living the same block of time, and our immediate location of where we are, what else is going on in our lives, what else is going on with our bodies, none of that matters. That this is a neutral vessel that can be added, can be manipulated, can become part of an equation. So time is neutral and, kind of absent of context or content. The second ontological idea about the world is that growth can be unrestrained. And this goes to the kind of idea that time can be part of an exchange for labor and in service of profit. So that because time is neutral, it can be used to manipulate and kind of encourage unrestrained growth. There is no limit on how fast we can work, how many hours we can devote to the project of work, and therefore the profits and kind of competitive advantage of a certain workplace. And part of this is the idea that future can be controlled. So technologies of scheduling, practices of projecting the future, that these ideas that time is chunkable and owned and can be manipulated in these ways also suggest that futures can be controlled. I know this is getting kind of deep, but we're going to move on quickly. So where did these ideas come from? And this is not entirely new knowledge at all, but I want to replace this current moment of the ideal worker socio-temporal order into a long kind of backward history of Western economic and philosophical approaches to time, which inevitably, or not inevitably, that's not the right word at all, but which did colonize the world in service of kind of making globalized markets. So there were times in history where different local cultures have different approaches to time, that time could be that certain hours were worth more than other hours, that certain hours actually could be kind of duration longer than other hours, that when a new leader kind of came into power, that they could change the temporal system. That was eradicated when globally we began to see the earth as a marketplace that required a commodification of time. So first, Marx was the first one who had the idea that you have to empty time and make it a container in order to kind of feed it into the capitalist enterprise. So if you're going to have a work time labor exchange, that time has to be kind of emptied so that it can be revalued based on the efforts of labor and what that labor is able to produce. But that in itself wasn't enough. Weber really talks about the Protestant ethic in the West and how the Protestant ethic had a kind of beautiful / scary alignment between suppression of individual desires in service of the glory of God and the manifestation of the glory of God through profit. So that if you could discipline the self in service of work and make a lot of money and show that you were prosperous, that this was the way that this was not a value of being greedy, but it was a representation of your worth through the profits. So this became the seeds for the idea that time is money, because dedicating time in this arena means that you could realize more money and show the God's privilege. And then these two things, you can see here how this set up the idea of the ideal worker, how it set up the idea that dedication to work, availability to work, subjugation of any other needs, desires, all of these things are in service of kind of what is the ideal in terms of what it means to be a good worker and a good human. Then these things rose in lockstep, as I said, with technologies of globalization. So the very first time we turned on the light, that meant that you could turn night into a working day, and that expanded what hours could be focused on work. Trains meant that in order to get goods and services, in order to facilitate exchange, that we had to have temporal zones that were shared and agreed upon. And then now we have the simultaneity of the internet, which even kind of the idea of network time, that this kind of eradicates the idea that a a time moment, a moment in time is substantively different depending on where you are in the globe. Right now, we can still pretend to a harsh degree that this moment of time is the same for all of us, even though I'm stumbling over my words because I'm tired and some of you aren't. But we still have this idea that this is the same moment in time for all of us. And so the bottom line is that the socioeconomic and digital practices in this regime of the ideal worker are premised on shared assumptions that time is decontextualized, quantifiable, the idea that it can be measured, that we know what time it is, that we know how long I'm supposed to speak, that we know when this session ends, that we can coordinate based on this idea of clock time, that is finite, that time has a beginning and an end, and it's going to end for all of us, and that it is scarce, that it is a resource that is not regenerating, and therefore the degree to which we kind of dedicate it to work, that's why it has such symbolic meaning, because if something is scarce, then it matters in terms of its value. And that mechanical clock time really is a shared fiction. We could measure time in another way. At this point, it's really hard for us to even conceptualize of that, but it's reified through measurement, action, and embedded in all of our technologies of the day. And this also means that time is this abstract resource, as I said before, is owned by the individual. So there's this individualistic orientation to time, that I have the ability to sell it to the highest bidder, that is emptied of local meaning, and then it becomes repopulated as compressed labor. So that once I sell my time for the workplace, I can then repopulate that time with labor in service of the workplace. And in this whole way of understanding time and applying it to work cleaves our temporal kind of experience from our bodily, spiritual, or mental needs. And you can begin to see this chafe. I mean, it's chafed, I think, throughout time. But I think that we're seeing more and more evidence of this chafing today, and I'll get into that. So who benefits from the ideal worker as a socio-temporal order? Well, if time is a subjective empty container that is given exchange value and can be realized as profit, well, then it can be sold as product for the benefit of the organization. So more and more organizations, and this is both just-in-time work, that something like a restaurant that uses just-in-time algorithms for their servers, to gig work or Uber or Lyft. Part of their value, their monetary value, is that someone will be there when you need them. So the idea that worker time is the product for the benefit of the organization. This is also true with professional knowledge work, with the idea that someone will be available to you 24/7. Managers can call upon the temporal resources of workers without restraint or predictability. And this goes back to the idea that I can expect you to answer an email at midnight, or I can schedule you for a last-minute shift, or I can take you off the schedule for a last-minute shift. And this is oftentimes these practices of just-in-time work or calling upon the temporal resource of others has been normalized through the kind of experience of communicating through information communication technologies. So the idea that instead of having to call you and tell you you're no longer working today, I can just click something in my HR algorithm, and then you've got an automated message, that I send you an email or a text that I know you'll see, but I don't actually have to face the idea that I've bothered you at 10 p.m. and asked you to fill in a spreadsheet. And tracking, GPS, dashboards, sensors, and AI can all be used to realize these socio-temporal orders by extending and compressing units of time allocated to work. And by this, it means we can increase the number of hours that we expect people to work and people expect themselves to work. And we can also compress what goes on within those hours through things like a platform that directs your every turn on an Uber application, or the technology is going to compress how much work we put into an hour. And you can see this beginning through factories and assembly lines and gig work today. And so who benefits? Well, of course, the organization benefits. That's the whole reason why this system is in existence. And the trickle-down effects of capitalizing on the temporal resources of workers are oftentimes invisible and kind of coded as irrelevant. And there's a lot of interesting scholarship out there that has been trying to surface the kind of trickle down effects of the sociotemporal order of the ideal worker. And there's fascinated by work by Clausen and Gersel that really thinks of time as a web and tracks the degrees in which, how a reverberation of the web over here affects other kind of elements of the web. So your ability to control your schedule, your ability to have predictability, your ability to know how much time you're kind of dedicating to the workplace really isn't about you, it's about others in the web and how they pull upon your time. And this can be everything from a daycare worker that calls in sick and all of a sudden you can no longer dedicate time to work if you have a child in that daycare, to a decision of someone higher up in management that you're going to stay late and therefore you have to, and that might have trickle down effects. In the book that Marco just so nicely introduced, Christine and I talk a lot about the necessity of scaffolding for any single human being to appear as if they are an ideal worker. So if you see someone in your workplace who is enacting all of the norms of the ideal worker, because remember, these are kind of ideals rather than the reality of people's everyday life. But if someone looks like they're able to dedicate everything to work, either they truly do have zero obligations outside of the workplace, or more likely they have a group of people on the back end supporting that kind of mask of ideal worker. So that it requires a whole army of scaffolding that is oftentimes gendered labor performed by women, not always, but oftentimes, can be a mix of formal and informal work relationships. So it could be relying on friends and family members and neighbors, or it could be paying, house cleaners and daycare workers and babysitters. But whatever it is, there's a whole army of people that kind of all that work is rendered invisible, and in some ways is in service of the organization, so that this one person can come to work and appear to be the ideal worker, and not just appear to be the ideal worker, they're actually engaging with work under the kind of norms of the ideal worker, and under that regime, we're just not noticing all of the work that's going into allowing that to happen and that the organization is benefiting from. And actually, Christine and I are going to be giving a talk tomorrow morning about temporal cascades and the specific ways in which one person's time in service of work cascades down into other people's time in their life. So the ways in which these kind of structures of scaffolding are actually tied together in temporal cascades. So if I'm asked to stay late, what does that do to everybody on the back end? And whether or not that is something that we take for granted in our home lives or that we're constantly negotiating and navigating depends a lot on the structure of the home front and how we have kind of shaped our temporal commitment to work in terms of our family and personal dynamics. And then the location of risk and uncertainty. So who is taking on the burden of risk? Who is taking on the burden of uncertainty in terms of both schedule, pay, whether or not I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and have enough money to feed my family and myself? That the location of risk and uncertainty has been offloaded more and more on individual workers. And this is both true in precarious work and more secure work. So the trickle-down effects really do hurt the individual, and they are kind of the army of people that are helping them and benefit the organization. And the bottom line, as I've already said, is that other possible ways of orienting to work are difficult to conceive of and even more difficult to put into practice. And one construct that I've been exploring with Leslie Perlow is whether or not what would it look like in the workplace to orient to time as a collective resource? And this is something that we've really struggled to talk about and write about, no less kind of theorize, which is the idea that so much of our ideas about time are premised on time as an individual resource. And can you imagine what it might actually look like in terms of, collective relationships, coordination, and communication in the workplace if we actually thought of time not as my time and your time, but our time? And what do we have to do by this deadline, or what do we have to do by tomorrow, would reframe our orientation to time. But that's very hard for us to think about, no less put into practice. Okay, and I titled this talk a little bit about maps and mazes because I'm really fascinated with the idea of both of these constructs. So you think of maps as a vision of a terrain that is necessarily kind of objectified and with a lot of the detail erased in order to allow for navigation. And you can think of multiple maps on top of each other that reveal different aspects of the terrain. And mazes, in a way, suggest interconnection, non-linear movement. You're not going from A to B in a maze, inability to totally control where you are, what you're doing, or what is next. And I would love to take some time with all of you to think about what these constructs, how these constructs would help us think about time differently. And by time in this case, I mean time in relation to individual lived experience and allocation to the workplace. And some early thoughts about temporal maps and mazes is that these temporal orders are not monolithic. It's not as if the socio-temporal order of the ideal worker eradicates other temporal orders. We still have a lived experience of time through our bodies. We still get hungry, tired, sick, we age, we need to sleep, all of those things. That doesn't go away, even though these constructs of time render those things irrelevant. We still have the temporal order of the physical and natural world. We still have, days and seasons and so forth. And so, these temporal orders are layered on top of each other and not necessarily within lock fit, meaning that, they don't click together in a perfect way. There's a lot of chafing. And temporal interdependencies, how I engage with time and how you engage with time within social groups, are the norm, and that they require active manipulation and a lot of negotiation. So even though we have ideas about kind of shared schedules, we're all here at the same time because the academy management told us to show up at this particular moment on the clock, and we did that. So there can be ways that the mechanism of clock time structures our lives, but in the nitty gritty of daily life, there is a lot of coordination. I can tell you, when my husband's going to work in the other room, when my kids might be waking up. We had to talk about all of this last night so that I could be here today with you. So there's lots of on the ground coordination around temporal interdependencies that also don't fit in to these ideas of the socio-temporal order of the ideal worker. And these layered temporal orders, they chafe in practice. And I think that this is one of the ways in which we're seeing more and more the appeal of flexible work. This is not new that flexible work is appealing, but I see more and more kind of the idea that, flexible work could be the answer to the temporal burdens of the current kind of form of temporal forms of our assumptions around work relationships and the ideal worker. So the idea that we could choose not just the timing of when we work in regards to like what time of day, maybe it makes sense for me. We've recently been doing this study with independent workers during COVID. COVID wasn't the kind of driving force of the study, but one of the interesting things is for some people, being able to do your work at 4 a.m. actually makes sense given all of the other challenges and expectations and draws on your time. Where others really want to be able to do their work when they feel most awake or most creative, and they actually engage in a lot of activities to get themselves in the right mental or physical state to perform work. So being able to choose when and where you work, so location of the day, the amount of clock time you dedicate to work, so that if it takes me an hour to do something, that's sufficient in terms of what I've done that day, in terms of my workplace, that is sufficient. I don't have to sit there and twiddle my thumbs for 7 more hours because of some idea of clock time and dedication. And control over the order of tasks and temporal compression. So what I actually do within a chunk of time. These are incredibly appealing agencies, and they kind of motivate a lot of the kind of ideas around flexible work and the reasons why people hope for, seek out, and feel that being able to engage in flexible work will solve a lot of their temporal problems. However, there are limited avenues to push back on the dominance of the ideal worker regime. And so the idea that flexible work is the only way to go, that you have to separate from the organization in order to realize some of these temporal agencies, is kind of baked into our ideas of time in relation to organizations. And so we haven't thought broadly about what might it look like for organizations to truly foster different forms of flexible work. I know that there's lots of experiments about this, but it has yet to take hold as something that we can enjoy within the context of structured work in classic organizations. And those who take advantage of the promises of flexible work find very quickly that while they may realize some of those values, they are taking on entirely new costs, new pressures, and new uncertainties, and new forms of work. So now that there is both a freedom and a very, very significant burden to being able to engage in flexible work. And that's both with building your own infrastructures, to navigating when and how you're needed, to presentation of self to those you work with, to uncertainties about where your next paycheck is going to come from, et cetera, et cetera. So the kind of appeal of flexibility is the only way to push back against the socio-temporal order of the ideal worker really comes with great costs. Not that it's not worth it. I know a lot of people who've chosen to live this life and they still think it's more valuable than working for a traditional organization, but yet it's still got great costs. So this is my question that I want to leave off with. Is it possible that we are actually on the cusp of a new temporal order? And I don't know if this is true, but it's something that I want to explore and ask your opinion of. So what are the opportunities for reshaping our kind of orientations to work and time in this connected, tracked, and pandemic-infused world? And my thinkings come from kind of a lot of what's out there and what you kind of are hearing and how people are engaging with time after a year and a half in this global pandemic. So first of all, we all know that we've experienced significant fear of physical proximity for good reason. But this fear that is shared and tied to a very clear consequences undermines the idea that FaceTime should be a proxy for dedication. It just doesn't make sense if you're going to be doing actual physical FaceTime if we can't be in the same room together. Also, I think that this experience of the pandemic has made visible some of the webs of interconnection and the temporal cascades. So the idea that the realities of what's going on in people's lives outside of work have been made visible in more and more ways. There's only so much that we can hide on a Zoom call in our homes. You hear the dog barking, you hear somebody come who needs to help, help the burst pipes. I was on a work call recently and someone's pipes burst and the plumber had to come in. You see children, anybody who works with me has seen my children repeatedly on Zoom calls, et cetera, et cetera. And the mental and emotional costs may have hit a limit. The mental and emotional costs of truly engaging in this temporal regime suggests that there are possibly limits to thinking of time use as identity, and that challenges time use as a proxy for performance. So we may have hit a limit, and maybe I'm just hoping here, but that we may have hit a limit to how much we can subjugate our own needs in service of these temporal orders. And this is in vast numbers, right? No one person can say, I'm too tired to go to work. But potentially when we have these large collectives that are beginning to realize the mental and visible costs of the current socio-temporal orders, that there will be an opportunity to reshape what those orders are. Shifting work arrangements expose weaknesses of the ideal worker temporal order. So it's been very clear that who is leaving the workplace by choice or not is not kind of equally shared. We're not equally sharing the burdens. So we know that from a gendered perspective, women are leaving the workplace at 3 to 4 times the rate of men. And that's both because they're being fired and because they're choosing to leave because of the draws on their time from other domains of life. And who is forced to work in unsafe environments? So what does it mean to actually value someone's time when they are forced to work in unsafe environments? So essential workers, food service workers, et cetera. And work from home and hybrid work arrangements expose time value calculations in new ways. So how do we, if we can't make the amount of time you dedicate to work proxy for productivity, how do we measure productivity? How do we pay people? How do we value your time versus my time if you're actually dedicating less time to work or you have more strains on the home front? And this is something that virtual teams and virtual workplaces are actively negotiating. And what would it look, we may be revaluing time is contextually dependent and lived experience. And this goes back to the idea that you can only hide so much on a Zoom call. So we're repopulating time based on where we are located in new ways. And I don't know if this means we're on the cusp of a new temporal order, but I would love to do it. And my very last idea is thinking about this not just as the state of the world out there, but what would it actually mean for us as social theorists and management researchers to kind of engage with social relations of time as integral to our project of research in the OCIS community. And Barbara Adam is one of my favorite time theorists, and she wrote, people's involvement with time is through particular practices and technologies. And this requires that we, kind of theorists, give attention to time as theory in practice, experience and explanation, lived orientation, and material expression. So this is something that we can take on in the kind of course of doing our work. And we can question our own orientations to time because, of course, we're part of the societies that orient to time in certain ways. So some like tips and thoughts that I would like to talk more about with you here is how would we think about time in our study design? How do we measure time in our studies? Do we only use quantified work time? Do we only use clock time? How do we measure an hour worked? How do we measure whether that's a productive hour or a non-productive hour? What does that even mean? How do we measure productivity? Is one of the trickiest aspects of organizational research. In our gathering of data, are we taking on sociotemporal assumptions about the ideal worker? Are they baked into our survey or interview questions? Are we assuming that those who dedicate certain amounts of time to work are better, that are kind of qualitatively better at their jobs? And what would it look like to revalue who is productive and how we could measure that? In our data interpretation, what are we doing in terms of making time use data a case of? So are we assuming that when people dedicate time to work, that's individual choice? Is that about their preference and personality? Is that about their organizational commitment? Is that about their love and passion, their identity for the organization or for the nature of their work? So what are we making kind of these choices about time use? First of all, we're thinking of them as choices, which I think assumes something. And second of all, what are we thinking that those choices are a case of? In our analysis of data, are we equating units of time to abstract constructs such as productivity and dedication? In our theorization, are we making unintentionally or otherwise unidirectional claims that technology shapes time, or that individual personality or preference leads to certain styles of work? Are we really taking into account the webs of interconnectivity and how people work together and the ramifications of temporal allocations? And then perspective. Are we noticing, and then moving more important than noticing, questioning the emic perspectives on times? So when people assume something about time, are we noticing that? And are we questioning whether or not that needs to be the way it is? And this is kind of similar, thinking about ideas, just kind of tricks for ourselves. So how might we actually get out of our own temporal orientations in order to study temporality in the workplace? So we need to question our taken for granted shared assumptions about the meanings associated with time use. Think about time as a web, not a line. Notice scaffolding and temporal cascades and the work that goes into holding up certain temporal regimes. And that's also the cost to the individuals there. Problemizing the time technology relationship with critical reflection on why and how new technologies are shaping the lived experience of time. Resurfacing the temporalities of nature and the body. So when is it that the kind of temporalities of nature and the body align with our sociotemporal orders, and when are they, bumping up against them, and in what ways were the effects of that? Valuing temporal and economic stability for all. Is this a natural right that people can know? Is it a natural right that we should have control over time, that we know that we can predict when we need to dedicate time to work and how that might affect ourselves and others around us? Is it a natural right to know how much you're going to make each week? We don't seem to think so, not in the way that work is currently constructed. And examine what can't be tracked and made visible through current practices of measurement and evaluation. One of my favorite old studies was Jeff Bowker and Lee Starr looking at nurses when they were trying to they were given the authority to develop their own rubric of work so that they could be tracked based on what they thought was important. So this was an exercise in agency in defining your work practices in order to be held accountable to what you thought was valuable. So in some ways, it was really the best case scenario for tracking and measuring work. But one of the most interesting findings from that study was that it's very difficult to measure humor. And it turns out that a really good nurse is funny. And so there's ways that even when you give people the authority to track themselves and to create their own regimes of evaluation, that there are certain things that don't fit into those regimes. And I think, the reason that we end up kind of relying on abstract constructs like time, it's not abstract, but we have abstracted the concept of time in order to measure and evaluate each other. It's because it's incredibly difficult to actually evaluate and measure based on some of the other properties of work that matter most to getting the job done, to working well with others, etc. So as long as the commodification of time functions as a taken for granted feature of our lives, the associated inequities with those assumptions remain invisible. The task for social theory, therefore, is to render the invisible visible, show relations and interconnections, and begin the process of questioning the unquestioned. And that's what I want to leave you at. And thinking about how might we as a community of management scholars and social theorists and people who truly, truly care about work and the relationship between technologies and work, how might we question our own assumptions about temporal orders, both in our daily lives and in our research. And I'm going to leave you with this one thought from Durkheim, which is the categories of human thought are never fixed. It's hard to imagine that when you're entrenched in a certain category of thought, but they're never fixed in one definite form. They are made, unmade, and remade incessantly, and they change with the place and the time. And I do think we're at an interesting moment in terms of place and time that could be a moment for questioning the current sociotemporal orders and creating new ones. And this is at a really widespread. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been following the news about Simone Biles and the Olympics. And I know that's not about time, but the very idea that someone is pushing back against dominant modes of expectation of what it means to succeed, and that there's this outpouring of support and not so much support for those choices, to me suggests that we are in a moment where we've hit some limits in terms of our ideals about ourselves and our relationship to our work. So there might be an opportunity to rethink even within the profit-driven capitalist economies of today. So you can tell me I'm wrong. And this one graphic, I actually saw this last night when I was checking Instagram, and I thought, I'm seeing more of these things on social media. They're very silly and they're small, but there are enough people out there trying to push a different dominant logic of letting time be contextualized and lived and not every day be the same. But I thought I would put this up there. This is what somebody posted, let every day be what it needs to be, which is if you actually dig into that thought, is kind of so dramatically different from the sociotemporal orders that I think we tend to take for granted. Okay, that's it. So I went a little bit long, but we have lots and lots of time to chat. So please, let's have some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa. That was a wonderful presentation. Actually, I have several questions, but I don't want to take over too much. But I'd like to ask one, at least, about, can you please expand on the relationship between technologies of the day and the sociotemporal orders?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I wove that in without fully attending to that question anywhere in the talk, partly because it's complicated, but partly because I do think that there is no way that technology doesn't matter, right? Of course it matters. It matters in how we experience time. It matters in how we experience proximity. I mean, we wouldn't be here without Zoom, right? We wouldn't be in this temporally dislocated, physically dislocated space that we somehow feel like we're all, communicating together. So clearly technology matters. And clearly the properties of technology, the properties of simultaneity, of constant, connectivity, of being able to radically transform our environment so we can light the dark and heat the winter and all of these things. These matter in how we experience time as as something that we can use, right? If you're too cold, if it's too dark, if you can't get in touch with someone, you're not working. Like that just takes away that possibility. But what I think is particularly important is all of those capabilities of technology to light the dark, to warm the winter, to create kind of an experience of simultaneity, to bring us in this room, that we use those capabilities and we design technologies with the goal of furthering our values, furthering our norms and values, and taking for granted assumptions about what time is, and more importantly, how it should be used. Right? So if we had a very, very strong norm and value about think before you speak, we would use email differently, right? If we had a very strong value that what we're going to evaluate each other on is the quality of the product you produce, whether or not that's a legal memo or a shoe that doesn't fall apart. If that were truly our metric of how we assess work, we would use technology differently. So it's both. So what I want to get at is that technology both facilitates and kind of perpetuates our ideas about time, and that our ideas about time are kind of this like motivating force for how we design and understand technology.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Actually, I have another question, which is in part a follow-up. So at some point you said, and I believe now you are speaking on behalf of the workers, not of the company. And at some point you said, well, who benefits from this? The company, managers, you know, because they can survey it better. But I wonder if managers can do something to mitigate the dominance of ideal work expectations on organizational practice and lived experience in the workplace. Probably a very practical question, but do you have insights about that?
I love that question, because I actually misspoke if I said that managers are the beneficiaries of these temporal orders. Managers are slave to them just as much as those below them. It's the kind of the organization itself is kind of an abstract entity directed around profit. That's what benefits. Managers are people with lives, and they are, while they are oftentimes in a position to be controlling the temporal allocations of those below them, they themselves are also kind of part of these temporal orders. And so the first answer to your question is, I think we all are kind of at the we are all subject to these temporal orders, and who benefits is the organization itself in an abstract way. But then the more practical part is some people do have more power in the workplace than others, right? It's just, you know, those of us with tenure have more power than those people without tenure. I'm sorry for those of you without tenure, you will be in our ranks soon. But the fundamental fact is that there are different power dynamics in the workplace in terms of job security, in terms of your own reputation and respect, in terms of whether or not others will listen to you. And I do think that, you know, I don't think that changing kind of dominant ideas about time should be or could realistically be at the, like, you know, be put on the shoulders of individuals. But at the same time, I think individuals in positions of power can do things to affect the temporal kind of ways of experiencing that lived temporal experience of the ideal worker culture within specific settings. So if a manager has a work group, they can create temporal norms that push back against expectations of constant availability. They can be public. They can actually talk about and admit the temporal kind of strains that they're getting from other aspects of their life. They can begin to kind of create evaluative norms where I'm going to evaluate you based on whether or not you said you were going to do what you did. You know, you did what you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do it, not being at the ready for my every win. So I'm going to leave you alone as long as you know, do what you said you're going to do by then, and we have some way of evaluating whether or not you did it well. So there's lots of ways that I could talk about the ways in which my temporal allocations to the workplace are affecting others in my life. I could make different trade-offs. I could say, I have to go home now because it's my turn to do this, or, you know, or because, you know, I'm really tired, or because I really want to go to this yoga class, you know, or because I need to pick my kids up from daycare and I don't have anybody else to do that. So there are lots of ways that managers or those with small degrees of power in the workplace can begin to reset norms at the ground level.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I wonder if some of my fellow colleagues, officers, have any questions for Melissa. and then I have plenty from the audience.
That makes me happy. I haven't been watching the chat, so I'm glad to hear that, because you never know on Zoom if you're talking to a bunch of dead faces or engaged people. It's just really hard to know on Zoom.
We're taking care of it. Anyone from the officers with questions?
I can start. Melissa, thanks so much for a wonderful talk, really interesting and inspiring, and wanting me to push and look at this theme of sociotemporal orders in more detail. I guess that there's many. Let me just try and keep it brief so that we can get to the audience questions as well. But you know, throughout your presentation, you highlighted in a number of ways, in different ways, I guess the role of emotion. You know, you talked about the nurses being funny. You talked about the outpouring of support, and it made me think about what some of the level of analysis that you see the sociotemporal orders being of influence. The workplace obviously is the key focus for you, but a lot of these issues around community, what we've been seeing with COVID, it suggests that maybe there's intersections that are becoming more prominent. And I just wondered if you could comment maybe a little bit more on the emphasis that you were having at different times in your talk around the emotional, or the what I'd call the community aspect that might be becoming more central.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, so that's a hard question, because I'm something I'm struggling with myself, because I don't want to come across as thinking that happiness is the answer, and that, you know, if we feel good, then we're doing the right thing. Because I think that we already have this kind of pervasive, kind of positive, kind of almost manipulative idea that people need to have positive emotion. But I do think that our emotional reactions to experiences of time should be attended to. And by this, I mean that when I do feel good about how I spent my time, when I feel guilty about how I spent my time, I feel like time use is almost this kind of it becomes this kind of the fault lines of our emotion. We tend to kind of coalesce our emotions and our experience of our everyday activities based on time use. And this is baked into some of the ideas that in order to be a good person, I have to be, quote, productive. I have to use time wisely. You know, that I have to spend my time in order to get more money out of it, to extract its value. And so the idea that we, you know, our fault lines of kind of guilt, of pleasure, of sense of self as something that I'm proud of versus ashamed of, that these are oftentimes tied to our sense of our own use of time. And I don't know about you, I think that as academics, we're in a really interesting place where, you know, there are certain work tasks that I do that take a lot more time than others, and I can't quantify that. Like I can't always know whether or not, you know, how long it's going to take me to think of something or to write something, versus, you know, through certain tasks I do know how long it's going to take me to sit in a faculty meeting. I kind of know. And I think that thinking about what are the emotional weights that we kind of latch on to certain kind of forms of temporal engagement really is something that we need to attend to in ourselves and question, both in our research and ourselves. So I don't know if that's really answering your question.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, linking to the experience of time. And I like that, the emotional weights. Thanks so much, Melissa.
Thank you. And anyone else of the officers have questions? I think, Katie, you wanted to ask one?
Yeah, Melissa, thank you so much. My head is sort of going off in all kinds of different ways, trying to synthesize what you've been talking about. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about cultural differences in perceptions of time and how those might be overlaid. So years and years ago, when I worked for IBM, it was really clear that there was an IBM cultural perception of time. But when I was working with colleagues in different parts of the globe, their perceptions were certainly very different, or sometimes different.
Yeah, that's a super interesting and complicated question for two reasons. One is that, orientation to time, as I've tried to describe, I do believe is very socially constructed. And so that becomes socially constructed differently among different cultures. And that can be, kind of cultures that are tied to nationalities, cultures that are tied to organizations, so forth and so on. And being a competent player in that culture, really like being socialized as one of us, I think it was very, Edward T. Hall talks about the kind of dance of life and the socialization of time, that being culturally competent in a culture means understanding the temporality, the rhythms, the pacing, and what is expected kind of in terms of engaging with time within this group. So how quickly do I get back to someone? How quickly do I get something done? Whether or not it's legitimate to take time for certain forms of activity, like the idea that I need to nap, that's totally legitimate in some places and absolutely not legitimate in other places. The idea that I should prioritize my body in terms of its needs and time. These can be anchored to local groupings, right? And not all, I mean, I don't mean to say that like, it's always good to take the body into account, right? You may be in a cultural environment where it's expected that you work your body to the max because, true warriors are also triathletes, and that can be wonderful, but it can also be too extreme. So I do think there are cultural orientations to time that are embedded in social groups, but I also think that those are that they're still relevant and they still chafe against these dominant sociotemporal orders that I'm talking against, but those dominant orders are fairly dominant, right? Like we just don't have, socioeconomic environments that are totally divorced from capitalism. I know there are different degrees, but there's very few places in the globe that we actually are divorced from clock time, from the idea that time is transferable, the idea that time can be filled with labor, that this may be more or less true in different cultures, but there's very few places that is no longer an orientation to time. So it's more, I feel like temporalities at the margin rather than a wholesale difference in kind of what time is and how it's tracked and measured.
All right. Thank you. I think we have another quick question from Jan, and then I'll try to summarize some of the questions from the chat.
Okay. Thanks, Melissa. I'll ask a question. So yeah, thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. My head is spinning right now and I'm trying to think of how to ask my question, but I mean, I was thinking about, so I guess one big question I have is just how much agency do we have and how much ability do we have to negotiate the socio-temporal order? So, you talked about these external forces like capitalism, which is relentless in its pursuit of profit, and, globalization and the Protestant ethic, so you kind of talked about the socio-temporal order as this, external force that, operates on us. But, there may be different ways to negotiate, different temporal orders. And I'm also thinking about how that relates to kind of boundary management, so there are different ways of negotiating this. You can look at, a lot of European countries have government regulations and company policies that limit, that create more rigid boundaries between work and life, right? You can't check your work email on the weekend, so that might be one way of trying to resist this and challenge the ideal worker notions. But then you talked about flexible work as another way of challenging this and kind of choosing, maybe having more permeable boundaries. So can you talk about like how this might relate to boundary management?
Absolutely. So I think the bottom line is that I don't mean to come across as that we are kind of we're all like without thought kind of slave to this system. I think we all live in terms of it and that it's heavy-handed in its expectations of us, but how we internalize those expectations, how we make sense of them in our local social orders, and how we might find spaces to push back. There's a lot of agency and flexibility there at those margins. And I mean everything from, I was thinking about the ideal worker in terms of the academic, and I don't know about the rest of you and your experience of being academics, But for me, I do feel that while the ideal worker is kind of out there in the world and maybe something that I hold myself accountable to, academia is not structured around measuring my every hour allocated to work. It's really structured around measuring the kind of some idea of the intellectual output and whether or not it's published or whether or not other people think it's interesting and compelling. Now, that's not entirely true, because I know there are ways that we uphold each other to ideal worker norms, but this occupation is not structured around those norms in the same way as some of the others that I talked about. I also think, so then that becomes, well, why am I holding myself up to these ideal worker norms? Because I've internalized them more than because my immediate colleagues or work structure requires me to. And so there are ways that we can kind of interrogate our own expectations of ourselves. Within social groupings, I do think there are ways that we can kind of rethink about time in terms of collectivity. So this idea of a collective notion of time as a resource, how do we coordinate explicitly and proactively so that we can get things done by this deadline in a way that honors the kind of differences in the local level of when am I busy versus when are you busy versus what other, how do our temporal cascades affect those around us? And then, there are, so I think that there are other bureaucratic answers that are separate from the kind of individual or local negotiations, which is thinking about creating more boundaries. I will say that I'm a little bit cynical about some of those bureaucratic answers, because I think if the values are strong enough, we'll find a way around them, right? So I do think that if the organization can say no emails after 5 p.m., but if the value is still motivating constant connectivity and accessibility, we're going to find a way, and actually it's going to be a new form of hierarchy within the organization, who is able to communicate after 5 p.m., either using a different channel like Slack or whatever else, or who's friends with who well enough that they can call and get the insider information, right? So it's almost like cutting off the hydra, like cutting one leg of the hydra isn't going to change this unless we change the values. Now, it's a message from the company that we don't expect you to be on email after 5 p.m., but those official messages can be undermined by local norms and power dynamics. So I don't disagree with bureaucratic answer. I just think we need to take them with a grain of salt. Does that answer, Jen?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I think, all right, before moving to the chat, Joanne, I think you want to ask a question.
Hi, Joanne.
So I started to ask I asked one question. Oops, I hit that incorrectly. I was trying to lower my hand. So I started to ask the question on the chat, but now I want to change take it farther. I asked early on about when you talked about time as power, whether is it the kind of power you were talking about is power over, but there's also this notion of power to do, which is sort of a feminist notion in political science that I learned about from Craig. And I'm wondering whether, and this power to do tends to be more collective also. And it made me wonder whether, maybe, I mean, the 8-hour day we got from collective action from unions, right? So is there a collective action answer? I mean, this is an odd thing for me to ask because I'm not normally one to be on the front of the picket line, but it does raise an issue about coordinated collective action around time.
Well, that's a fascinating question. And I think that's where I'm starting to see some of these kind of chafings that are coming out in the news, that are coming out in social media, that are coming out. There's this New York Times series called In Her Words. I don't know if any of you follow this. And it's kind of female stories of modern existence in some ways. And story after story is about these chafings, and they do have a gendered lens. And I don't think this is entirely a gendered problem, by the way, but you just see more and more of that. So I think the first step of collection action is frustration that is made visible, right? Like, and therefore you can see your frustration mirrored in the experience of others through those kind of channels of visibility, through media, or in today's day and age, social media or news media and so forth. I think we're seeing that. Like, I think we're seeing that through Simone Biles. I think we're seeing this in certain ways. Now,
Right.
whether or not that
I agree.
coalesces into collective action, into rethinking, what does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to be paid for our time? What does it mean to have a living wage? We're seeing that also with gig work a little bit, about collective action, about trying to push companies to think about gig work differently and pay people appropriately. So I don't know if it's going to take off, but I hope so. And I think as scholars, part of our job is not, I don't believe that we're necessarily social justice advocates, but I do think that our scholarship can help expose some of the logics that the current power structures are based on, right? We're not out there at the front of the picket line necessarily. Some of my students would disagree. I think that there might be generational changes in the ideas of what academics should and could, what role we should and could play into social justice questions. But my sense is that my job is to expose in order to provide frameworks and insight so that those social justice advocates who I will follow in my own time, not as a representative of UCI or as an academic, that they have the tools to foster some of that movement.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thanks for the fabulous talk.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you both. And actually, building on the last question, there's something that comes from the chat. Is a synthesis of a few questions, but it reads: you make a call to find a way to consider collective socio-temporal orders. What are some of the tensions that you see with the individual construct? Where should we begin to examine the collective perspective?
So now I'm going to just tell. So there's we as in individuals embedded in these socio-temporal orders, and there's we as those of us who've made our life work researching and understanding socio-temporal orders. And I guess I'm curious which one the question's getting at, or else I can just choose.
I think the individual.
So us as
Yes.
individuals, how do we understand the socio-temporal orders that we're part of?
It's for, yes.
Yeah, so I think this is where, kind of the lessons in critical reflection and trying to notice our taken for granted assumptions. So this is something, so think about this. When you send a text to a friend or to a partner or to a colleague and they don't respond right away, how do you make sense of that? Do you make sense of that as they're not very good at their job? They don't care. They don't care about me. They don't respect me. Or do you make sense of that as maybe they're busy? Maybe it's not about me. So I do think that our own kind of seemingly instinctive reactions to the ways that other people engage with and allocate time are one lens into questioning whether or not that instinctive reaction is the only reaction, right? Is the right reaction, is the kind of essentialist reaction that this A, equals B, or are we kind of infusing that reaction with these deeply ingrained socio-temporal orders of how others should allocate time and the signals that they're sending and how they allocate time. So I think that really, in order for us as individuals to rethink our embeddedness in this socio-temporal order is to challenge our own gut reactions to how we kind of make sense of and judge others based on their allocations of time. And that's just like training yourself.
Thank you. Thanks. Actually, someone else asked me to be able to ask you a question. AB, are you there? Uh-oh.
Yes, I'm here, but I
Hi.
have a crying baby, so you could just go ahead and ask the question.
Okay, sorry. Okay, that's fine. Actually, I do have a very pressing question, at least for me, which is obviously about ethics. So, because we talk about all these ways in which technologies can be used nowadays to let us work remotely, etc. And there's a lot of surveillance, right? So, for example, every time I attend a session at the Academy of Management, I kind of like gain 5 points or 10 points, which I have no idea what this is. And basically, this means that the Academy of Management knows exactly what I do every time I post, every time I do something. And that's a way for them to track what we do, right? You know, and nobody asks me permission for doing this, or perhaps when I signed off for like 50 pages agreement to participate in the meeting, there was something written down. Well, and actually we're going to track everything we do. But how do you see the ethical implications of these new work arrangements that clearly create power imbalances? Like every technology in organizations is connected with some unsettling of powers, but there's also an ethical aspect of this that concerns employees, managers, and the organization as an entity. How do you see this problem?
You know, Marco, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I found this like gamification of attending the Academy of Management, like truly fascinating and kind of disorienting, and also hilarious. And it's hilarious because it's so obvious, and this is just an academic conference. But I think what you're getting at is the more kind of pervasive and pernicious ways that these kind of tracking and kind of awarding of points and the gamification ways to nudge us into certain behaviors are infiltrating more and more aspects of life. So this one is funny because it's so obvious and not consequential. Like, I don't really, to me at least, I don't know about you, if any of you are really tracking your Academy Management points, like who's going to win the Academy here, right? Maybe there's some award of someone who gets the most points in the end. But so this is kind of a silly but very obvious example of something that I do think is more pernicious and pervasive. And so I would say a couple things. One, first of all, what can we track and what can't we track? The Academy is not giving any of us points for having an original thought. It's not giving any of us points for a connection we're making where we're learning something from someone else, right? It's not giving us points for actually any of our academic endeavors. So this is an academic conference, and so therefore that's kind of ridiculous. But it's because those things are very hard to track, right? That you can't, they're not obvious. They're not something that you can apply a quantitative value to. So the first question I think is what's trackable? And this goes right back to, we should very much interrogate what technologies can track, what is trackable. Because as soon as we track something, we make it real and we make ourselves accountable to it. So once you've tracked and measured something, you can never take away that kind of the output of that tracking and measurement. We can never ignore, who has more points than whose. So before we measure something, we better be very careful of what we're going to do with the outcome of that measurement, because we can't pretend we didn't measure it. We can't take that, we can't not know that outcome of that measurement. So that's one question. What are we tracking? How are we tracking it? What are we then accountable to once that has been tracked? And oftentimes, because what we're tracking doesn't actually align with our goals. So if we could track intellectual content, original thought, and intellectual passion in the Academy Management, that might actually be in line with our goals of the conference, and we should be held accountable to that. But if we're tracking how many sessions you go to and whether or not you've clicked this or that, is that in line with the goals of this academic conference? And if not, how are we being held accountable to those numbers? And then the second thing that you brought up is the ethics of it. So not only are we tracking and we have accountability to what we've tracked, but we also have kind of some people or some positions, not just tied to people, but positions of power that have a different sort of viewpoint or horizon on other positions, and they can then use that in different ways, right? So what kind of entity do I become to those who can track me? And we see this in HR dashboard systems and companies more and more, right? So if I'm being tracked by certain things, then that can be turned into and realized into whether or not I'm a good employee, whether or not I'm a good collaborator, whether or not I'm worth a raise or a promotion, whether or not I'm a risk, all of these things. So I do think that there's deeply, deeply ethical implications of not only what we track, how we're held accountable to it, but who can see it and how it can be used either for or against our own personal goals and aspirations? And these are just big questions. I don't have any answers, Marco, but it's really important phenomena that are happening in many, many spaces.
Yeah, thank you. Me neither, but I think one of the points of discussing these things is not really provide answers, but raise problems, so we can discuss the problems, because if we have the answers, probably, the problem wasn't really interesting, right? So I totally agree with you. And I was also thinking when you said something about what can we capture with technologies. We cannot capture maybe granular details on quality of contributions, but this is also something very subjective. And then maybe there's an algorithm that assesses these contributions, which becomes even like more nasty from some viewpoints. So yes, very, very complicated questions, and probably we will talk about these questions more and more in the future.
And those people who are kind of assessed by the algorithm are also held accountable to it, right? So that there's a relationship. I saw in the chat here, someone asked, who is the we making these decisions? I don't necessarily, sometimes it might be one person high up saying, I'm going to make these decisions. But oftentimes I think they're values encoded in technology that are let loose in the world and then have unexpected consequences. So I don't necessarily, I'm sorry if my answers are coming across as overly like pinpointed in a decision maker, because that's not how I think it actually happens.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Thank you so much. And actually, we have 3 minutes left, so I wouldn't challenge time and allow people to ask additional questions, but I would like to take this 2-3 minutes to thank you so much again for giving this wonderful keynote, Melissa. And I would like to also thank everyone for attending from wherever you are, and especially if it's not a very convenient time for you. Thank you. So let me remind you of something. We also have a social event this year. It's a virtual one, and we'll start at 12 p.m. today. So you can take a break, and then if you want, you can join us for something very loose. It's going to be a meeting like this one with people jumping in and out, and maybe we can chat about the keynote, about OCIS, or about the CTO. But anyway, 12 p.m. social event of OCIS, and thank you so much again, everyone, for attending the keynote, and thanks especially to Melissa, of course.
Well, thank you, everyone. You were a wonderful audience that I actually felt your engagement over Zoom, which is like, I feel like you should get an award. And I look forward to chatting more, seeing you in person, but also sticking around. I'll be here for the virtual social hour, though my children will wake up at some point and you'll see little heads in my screen. But I very much look forward to engaging with all of you on these tricky questions.
Thank you. And remember, for the social event, because it's going to be 5 somewhere, you can bring your wine.
Or your morning coffee, depending on where you're at. We won't judge either way.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Melissa.